Section 5.2 is adding and subtracting like fractions. Now, as far as adding and subtracting fractions, the easiest kind of fractions to add are ones that already have a common denominator, which is what it means to be like fractions. So if you look at this picture here, it kind of just puts a picture as to what it means for things to have like denominators. So if you have two pizzas, both cut into 6 pieces, in this piece I have 2 of the 6 pieces left. In this pizza, I have 1 of the 6 pieces left. If I were to put those pieces together, I have 1, 2, 3. Notice 3 out of 6 pizzas. So we're going to kind of derive our rule from this picture. To add or subtract fractions with the same denominator, that's the key word there, you're going to write the sum or difference of the numerators over the denominator. More simply put, you're going to add the numerators, keep the denominators. Alright, we are going to do 6 examples. Some will be kind of easy, some of them are going to get a little trickier. For the first example, alright, I want to add 3/8 plus 2/8. That rule that I just told you about said is in keywords here is you have to have a common denominator. Remember, denominator, talking about the bottom number of my fractions. They both have 8 in the denominator. Once you have a common denominator, you add your numerators. So I'm going to take 3 plus 2, and you keep the denominator the same. So in my numerator, 3 plus 2 gives me 6. The denominator just stays as an 8, but since we're super awesome, incredible students, we want to make sure our answer is simplified. So I'm going to divide out a 2 from both of those numbers. So my final answer would be 3/4. Okay, so that was a pretty simple one. Let's look at one that throws in some negatives. Let's try a -1/6 plus 5/6. Okay, first notice, I already have a common denominator, so I'm going to add my numerators. I'm going to keep my denominator. Now thinking back to your integer rules, to take -1 plus 5, I have different signs, so I will subtract. So I'm going to take 5 minus 1, which gives me 4, and it's going to be a positive 4 because 5 is larger and it is positive. And then my denominator still stays the same. I want to double check, and I can simplify this. I'm going to divide out a 2 for my numerator and my denominator, which gives me 2/3 for my answer. Next one. What about 4/9 minus 7/9? So this one, I have a subtraction instead of an addition. The only difference here is instead of adding my numerators, I'm going to subtract them. So we do this the exact same way. We're going to subtract our numerators, keep the denominators. Now 4 minus 7, what I notice about that is I have a smaller number minus a larger number. So I have to keep, change first, then I can use my integer rules. Now I have 4 plus a -7, and thinking through my integer song, I know that's going to give me a -3. My denominator still is a 9. And last thing, we want to make sure it is simplified. -3 divided by 3 gives me a -1. 9 divided by 3 gives me a 3 for an answer of -1/3. Okay, the next ones is we're going to look at some that have mixed numbers. So for this first one, we want to look at 2 and 11/12 plus 6 and 7/12. Now there's an easy way and there's a hard way to add and subtract mixed numbers. The hard way is probably the way that you've been taught up until this point in time, which probably told you that you needed to change both of these numbers into improper fractions, right? And you're going to get some kind of big numbers, which is so much fun if you just love math, but I know you guys, and you really probably don't want to do that. So instead, it can be a little tricky when it comes to subtraction, but most of the time it's going to be easier to deal with your whole numbers and your fractions separately. So if I want to take 2 and 11 twelfths plus 6 and 7 twelfths, I'm going to look at my whole numbers and I'm just going to add them just like I normally would. 2 plus 6 gives me an 8. For my fractions, 11 twelfths plus 7 twelfths, well, I already have a common denominator, so I'm going to look at my numerators. I'm going to add them together. 11 plus 7 gives me 18, and that rule tells me I need to keep my denominator, so it turns into 12. Now with these ones, the one thing that you have to check is you have to make sure that this one is simplified and also that it is a proper fraction. In this case, it is neither. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to take this fraction off to the side. I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to turn it into a mixed number because I notice I have the larger number in the numerator than the denominator. So if I change this into a mixed number, I know 12 will go into 18 one time with 6 left over out of 12. Now 6 twelfths can be simplified. I can divide out a 6 from both of those numbers, so I get 1 and 1/2. So what I want to look at, my fraction, this 8 twelfths here, is the same thing as 1 and 1/2. But that's not my answer because I had these 8 wholes over here. So I'm going to add this 1 to this 8 to give me an answer of 9, and then my fraction stays the 1/2. Okay, with adding, it's pretty easy to just go ahead and work through them that way. Where it gets a little tricky is whenever we start subtracting. And not all of them are going to work this way, but some of them will. So for this first one, let's look at 8 and 9 fifteenths minus 10 and 2 fifteenths. First thing that I want you guys to look at is I notice I'm subtracting. I also notice that I have a smaller number minus a larger number. So what I do first is I change this into an addition problem. So this is just like the normal integer rules. We're going to keep, change, change. Now I have 8 and 9 fifteenths plus a negative 2 fifteenths. If we think through that integer song, I have different signs, so I know I'm going to be subtracting. So whatever I end up going through, I know it's going to be a subtraction problem. Now I need to figure out what number we usually subtract from the other. And we know that we always take the larger number minus the smaller number. In this case, this is 10 and 2 fifteenths, and this is only 8 and 9 fifteenths. So I'm going to take the 10 and 2 fifteenths minus the 8 and 9 fifteenths. The last thing I'm going to do before I actually do the subtracting part is I'm going to figure out if my answer is going to be negative or positive. I'm looking for the sign of the larger number. The larger number is 10, and it is negative, so I know my answer is going to be negative. Once you figure out those two steps, that negative sign really doesn't matter. I'm going to ignore it, not too important. For this one, I'm going to look at my numbers or my fractions first. I want to take 2 minus 9, but 2 minus 9, that's a smaller number minus a larger number, which is going to give me a negative answer. Whenever we're talking about fractions with mixed numbers, that's not going to work. Instead, we want to borrow from the whole number. So think about borrowing whenever you're subtracting just regular numbers. If you borrow from the 10, it becomes a 9. Now think about this. When I borrow from the 10, I am borrowing one whole number from that 10. So I can't just add a 1 to this 2 fifteenths. I have to add whatever 1 looks like as fifteenths. And as fifteenths, we can always write 1 as a number over that same number. So instead of 1, we're going to write 15 over 15. So I'm going to add 15 over 15 to the 2 over 15. So my new fraction becomes 17 over 15. Now I can subtract my fractions. I have the same denominator. So I'm going to subtract my numerators. 17 minus 9 gives me 8. We're going to keep our denominator. Then I'm going to look at my whole numbers. I have 9 minus 8, which gives me a 1. So 8 and 9 fifteenths minus 10 and 2 fifteenths is negative 1 and 8 fifteenths. Let's look at another one where we may have to borrow. Let's look at 1 and 3 over 14 minus 10 and 1 over 14. Just like with the other one, I notice I have a smaller number minus a bigger number, so I'm going to keep change. Now I notice that I do still have different signs, so I'm still going to have different signs, subtract. Then I want to figure out whether my answer is going to be positive or negative. I'm going to look for the larger number, which is 10. 10 is negative, so I know my answer is going to be negative. Now I need to figure out what number I'm going to put on top, so I'm looking for my larger number. Just look at your whole numbers. This has 10 as a whole number, and this has 1 as a whole number, so I know that 10 and 1/14 is larger, so I'm going to put 10 and 1 over 14 in the top, and 1 and 3/14 on the bottom. Okay, let's look at our fractions. Once again, I'm taking 1 minus 3, where I have a smaller number minus a larger number. Not going to work, so I need to borrow. So I'm going to borrow from the 10. It becomes a 9. I'm going to add 1 to the 1 over 14, but remember, I can't just add 1. I have to add what a 1 would look like split up into 14 pieces. And it would look like 14 over 14. And when I add 1 over 14 plus 14 over 14, I get a new fraction as 15 over 14. Now I can take 15 minus 3, which gives me a 12. My denominator stays the same, and when I subtract my whole numbers, I get an 8. Now to always double check, make sure you can't simplify anything in this case. I can divide out of 2, so my final answer would be negative 8 and 6 over 7.